Are we okay for the recording? Excellent. Excellent. Perfect. So just before we start, first of all, good evening, everyone. And for those we haven't seen since the start of our sabbatical, it's wonderful to be temporarily back, and it's amazing to reconnect to the community and to have had this privilege of having experienced this opportunity of sabbatical. Just a few words about the format of this shiur. It's really split into two. I want to spend a few moments talking about the so-called assisted suicide or assisting dying bill and discuss where it's up to, what's going on, and some of the concerns that I feel, and I think we should all feel, around the passage or possible passage of this law, both from a general societal level and from a halachic point of view. And that will be part one of what we speak about. And part two will be trying just to look at some of the halachas around ends of life and termination of treatment, around which I think there's lots of misunderstandings, and just try and share some general perspectives on those. I also want to say that there is a dense and heavy source sheet that has been given out for those online, and I suppose who will listen to the recording on YouTube, that it will be posted in the link, and there should be in the chat of the Zoom, there should be a link to it. And for those here physically, there are some papers at the back. Please do not panic about this source sheet. We will not be working our way through these sources. I will be barely referencing it in the share. I may draw your attention to a line or two in it. I simply felt that when we are dealing with such a sensitive matter, the more I can give you access to the primary sources, the better. A couple of the sources are in fairly straightforward ivrit. Some of the other sources are very lengthy in a sort of dense rabbinic reasoning. And I felt that it's a range of sources, and I'll try and just explain to you what those sources are so that those that can access it are able to do so. Unfortunately, there is a very limited high-level information about this in the English language. But I did feel, given that we are talking about such an important and sensitive matter, that for those, to the degree possible, I did want to give people access to some of these sources. But again, don't worry about the source sheets too much. We won't be using them too significantly in this share. I also want to start off by acknowledging what a difficult and sensitive topic this is. And ultimately, I suppose all of us in this room have to face mortality, and none of us are here forever. And in addition, many of us already at this stage are perhaps having to look after elderly family, friends, parents, and beginning to grapple with the complexities of medical decisions and decisions around care, particularly towards ends of life. These are painful decisions. These are not simple decisions. And whilst I hope to share a halachic approach to this, and halacha has guidelines and rules around these things, certainly no judgment is intended of anyone. And I don't mean anything I say to be simplistic or to delegitimize the very real traumas and pains and struggles that people go through. These are big issues. These are issues around life and death. I also want to acknowledge that the title of this bill is sometimes referred to as assisted dying or assisted suicide. And again, both assisted dying and suicide are events that have affected people within our communities, within Northwest London and across the UK and across the Jewish world. And I don't mean anything I say to be judgmental of anyone or any individual, and to be commenting on their particular pain and experiences. Nonetheless, it is important for us to, in a hopefully sensitive manner, address some of these topics from a halachic point of view, and I think also from a very fundamental moral and ethical and societal level. Finally, I want to acknowledge the sterling work that doctors, nurses, and the whole medical teams and support teams within medical care, within hospitals, within the NHS do. Sometimes these discussions can descend into criticism, whether halachic or practical, of medical practitioners or of the NHS. And we are lucky to have to live in a part of the world with stunning and incredible medical care, and with an NHS that by and large works amazingly. And obviously the news focuses a lot on the areas where it doesn't work, and any organization has its failings and its limitations. But I just want to sort of put on the record that the level of care is phenomenal and remarkable, and we're lucky to have that. And there are doctors within the NHS, outside the NHS, non-Jewish doctors, Jewish doctors, religious doctors, from doctors, irreligious doctors, some of whom struggle sometimes with the halachic approach. And whilst we need to understand and be confident around it, equally we need to understand that sometimes this is not easy. And for those on the field who are there on the sort of coalface dealing with medical care, sometimes they can be themselves dealing with and carrying the load of and really bearing the pain of end of life care. And nothing I say this evening is meant to be simplistic or lacking recognition of these situations. Having said all that, just a brief summary of the proposed legislation, which is referred to in the popular press as the Assisted Dying Bill, more accurately, the Terminal Ill Adults Ends of Life Bill, 2024-2025. And this was a private member's bill, so it was not put forward by the government, it was put forward by a private member, and all the political parties, almost all the political parties took a decision that this should be a free vote. And the proposal was that were terminally ill adults to request assistance from a doctor to end their life, the bill would allow terminally ill adults to have the choice of an assisted death, in addition to the existing end-of-life options. That's the sort of definition of what this bill was. Now, there's a lot to unpick in that, but and a lot that indeed hasn't been finalised yet. The bill is still being worked out and worked through. But the concept is that doctors should be allowed to, in some shape or form, assist ill adults to end their life if this is what they so choose. And built into the bill are layers of protection, again, not fully fleshed out, but the individual must be at least 18 years old. There must be a medical history there, so they have to be registered with a doctor for 12 months. And they have some mental capacity to make the choice, which has to be assessed. They have to be expected to die within 6 months. And there have to be a series of declarations, 2 separate declarations witnessed and signed about their wish to die. They have to satisfy 2 independent doctors that they are eligible, possibly satisfy a judge also of that case. And this is basically the structure of the proposed bill. The private members' bill passed what's called the second reading, which is really the first vote in Parliament. It then moves on to the committee stage, where the real nitty-gritty of exactly what do we mean when we talk about doctors assisting death, to what degree, exactly how do the safeguards work, what are the exact provisions, are hopefully fleshed out until it becomes a worked-out bill, and then it goes through another vote and the House of Lords and so on. So it's mid-process. And I think from a Jewish and societal point of view, there are a lot of concerns, serious concerns around this. And I felt it appropriate to share these concerns. We live in a democracy, and it's important for us to be informed about the bill and about the concerns that I think we should feel around it. Within this room are people who work in care of the elderly, work in the medical field. Some people here have a voice that can be heard. But all of us, in terms of our duty as citizens within a democracy, do need to be informed and do need to voice an opinion around something which I think is very worrying. I think that the messaging that dignity, this is about dignity in dying, is a worrying one. It's a message that can negate the deep dignity that can exist in suffering, and does send a message that killing and the choice to end life can be okay. I think that as soon as we enter into a realm where we make judgments about quality of life, about decisions to end life, about the degree to which life is worthwhile and has merit, the degree to which a doctor or a legal professional can decide that this individual is able to make the choice to end their life, and that a doctor can facilitate and enable and somehow insist that that death puts us into a world of judgment about the value of life. And leaving aside halacha, for 2,000 years within, certainly in the West, the Judeo-Christian ethic, we've seen life as sacrosanct, meaning transcendent, meaning possessing a value that isn't measurable or quantifiable in human terms. And we don't descend into sort of weighing up the value of different lives and the utility of the life, how worthwhile that life is. And I think this is of grave concern. It's sacrificing a value which has held society and which has reflected how we view life. And it is a sacrifice on the altar of recognition of pain that people go through, nonetheless a seismic shift in how we see these things. Parliament making a profound ethical decision. I think there are worries around the safeguards, the issues of coercion, and to what degree we can really assess how much this is indeed the patient's will, that which the patient wants. The legislation in some shape or form is going to say that this has to be a competent adult. What does competence mean when we are dealing with people in extreme pain, perhaps suffering from exceptional mental anguish and mental torment? And to what degree is that able to be a judgment which we can genuinely assess? There are worries around coercion. We live in a society where, to the best of our knowledge, according to Age UK, somewhere close to 400,000 over 60s experience a level of domestic abuse, and we're not able to protect society from that. How do we know that we will be able to pick up coercion? Even cases which come to court, some 50% of coercive control cases, we're talking about financial coercion and other type of coercion, some 50% are dropped because of lack of evidence, and only about 4% of recorded claims about coercion actually end up in conviction. So how do we know that these checks can work? What does it mean to have confidence around coercion? Even a 2 weeks cooling off period is quite a statement. Do none of us experience decisions around far less significant things, perhaps a mortgage that we take out, or a financial decision that we make, or booking of a holiday, where over more than 2 weeks till we cool off and realize that perhaps the decision wasn't the wisest? The concept of usefulness becoming a measure of life, the concept of cases of mental anguish allowing and justifying a decision to end a life is very worrying and very scary. Incidentally, studies show that in areas where assisted suicide has been legalized, the rate of illegal suicide also increases and also goes up, because this increases a sense of this being a possible solution and a possible option. In Canada, where legislation for assisted dying was passed, I think in 2017, so we're looking at 7-8 years ago, doctors have been reported meeting patients on Zoom, and on that basis making decisions. And in other areas, I think in Oregon, for example, some 50% of cases where patients requested assisted dying, actually the reason they gave was because they felt they were a burden on their family and friends, and for that reason were requesting this decision. One can argue that almost every very elderly person who is nearing the end of their life, to some degree, other worries about being a burden on their family. Having, in our role, extensively spoken to elderly people and supported families through this, and just from personal experience, I think any of us who have contact with very elderly people know that this is an extreme worry, the concept of being a burden on their families. And what does this mean to have a society where that worry and anxiety about being a burden can be a reason for ending life? In Belgium and Holland, mental anguish has become included in the reasons for justifications for assisted dying and assisted suicide. Sometimes relatively young patients in above perhaps 18, but still within the nature of family dynamics, we would consider children very much supported by their parents. Perhaps children of 19, 20, 21 in Holland have been allowed to make decisions of which their parents are not informed. And by the way, the UK legislation has built into it that family does not need to be informed of this decision. So families can find out that their parents have taken this decision, in which patients are still dealing with mental health and where mental health can perhaps still be supported, are being assisted and facilitated in in their decision to end their lives. So I suppose just to register and flag here that I think we should be concerned about this. It is and does seem to be part of a broader pattern of society losing touch with that which has been seen as sacrosanct, that which has been seen as transcendent. And I don't mean this in a halachic or frum way. I mean this in the sense of a moral and values way, that whatever one's, this isn't just an argument made in the confines of a base medrash to us as ma'aminim, as believers in Hashem, as believers in Olam Haba, as believers in the value of life and neshama. There's an argument that I think needs to be shared beyond the confines of a shul and a base medrash. Any society needs that which is transcendent, needs to recognize values, needs to have that which is sacrosanct, needs to see a value, an infinite value in human life, and that some things are not measurable by the normal rubrics of value and weighing up one life against another. And ultimately, we should make no mistake, there is a weighing up of value of life going on over here, because certain lives assisted suicide is not an option for, and other lives it is. And the nature of that decision is being made in a manner which should raise concern. There's talk about two independent doctors, except one doctor can refer to another doctor, so one has to question what independence means. In some areas where assisted suicide has become legalized, there are clinics where doctors refer to each other, and you have this sort of circular and clinics which are known, nicknamed as death clinics, clinics where everyone knows the doctors will help, and they will sort of cycle the decisions around. And I think we should be concerned about both the nature of the safeguards put in place, the nature of the legislation, but more profoundly what this is saying and what messaging this is giving around life and the value of life. I want to acknowledge that there are cases where this can be very painful for an individual, and I don't mean to be dismissive of that. There are particularly cases around degenerative neuron diseases and the like, where people very far in advance can see a clock ticking and can see a very measured deterioration, which will lead to a severe lack of independence and of what most of us would consider dignity in life, the ability to function, basic bodily functions alone and the like. And again, I want to emphasize this is not being said with a lack of awareness or a lack of sympathy around and empathy around these cases. However, we do need to understand and look at what we are saying in society and what are the values that we hold in essence as a society before we walk down this path and where it can take us. Thus far, I would say about the general message of around assisted dying and suicide. Obviously, from a Jewish point of view, we have enhanced and increased concerns. And again, these are halachic concerns, but concerns that should ring true to certainly every person of faith and in any faith, and even beyond. In Judaism, we of course teach that our lives are not just there for utilitarian purposes, that each person has infinite value. Not just does each life have infinite value, but each moment of life has infinite value. And whilst we will look later at suffering and ends of life in more detail, nonetheless, we don't in and of in itself deem quality of life to be a criteria to measure the value of someone's life. Every moment of life is opportunity, conscious life or not. And we simply don't go down this path of measuring life in those terms. Moreover, we consider terminating life for another human to choose to end the life of someone else, even if that is what they request, as murder, as lo tzirtzach, as one of the aseres hadibros, as transgressing amongst the most chomo and serious transgressions that one can have. Suicide is not murder; it's suicide. But nonetheless, facilitating suicide and enabling and assisting is lifnei iver sit in front of a blind person, to not put a stumbling block, and with all the empathy that we can and should feel to people making very, very difficult decisions and facing sometimes terrible pain and suffering. Nonetheless, we should recognize that we do not have the ability to step over these halachas. Ultimately, we don't see ourselves as the owner of our lives. We ultimately see ourselves as belonging to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and serving a higher purpose. And from a halachic point of view, there isn't much debate around this point. These are basic halachic norms. We will look at halacha more fully shortly But I wanted to be clear, since I was starting off talking about from a societal point of view and a broader societal point of view, that obviously from a halachic point of view, there's many more serious issues around this. In a moment, I want to pause before we move on to the sort of more technical halachic look at some end-of-life issues. But I do want to say that nothing in halacha demands of us not to feel compassion and empathy and understanding of people facing these difficult decisions, nor indeed of those who in the end behave out of line with halacha. And I want to make that very clear. It is very clear in the poskim that the halacha doesn't call upon us to condemn and lack empathy for those who are going through extreme suffering and stepping over the halachic line. And we're able to, on the one hand, say this is wrong, this is against halacha, and this is a mistake, this is not what should be done in halacha. And on the other hand, accept that the person can sometimes face unbearable and near impossible situations. The Gemara speaks about the concept of the capital sins which no one should transgress, avodah zarah, not entering into idol worship or murder or sexual immorality. And the Gemara discusses the story of Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel, and so on, who they were threatened with death and didn't serve avodah zarah. And then the Gemara adds, had they faced unending suffering and torture, who knows if they could have passed that test? In other words, even when we're talking of the greatest of the great, the Gemara does not take a black and white approach in saying we would have to condemn someone who fails in this area. The Gemara simply says our task as Ma'aminim, as believing Jews, is to do our best to live up to halacha, to state halacha as it is, and to leave judgments of individuals to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, I hope that whilst I'm trying in this sense to give a very clear line in terms of the concern that I think we ought to feel, this isn't said with a lack of compassion. The final point I want to make is, and again, I do feel this is concerning, is that as soon as you do allow this to be a possibility, it shifts society's priorities in terms of finding other solutions. And where does this go? If someone chooses to end their life because of an overly long waiting list for treatment, what is this saying in terms of the resources that society dedicates to medical care? Surveys show that actually, in most cases, the decisions to end life, as I said, is around concerns about being a burden, around dignity. Are we investing sufficiently as individuals and as society in ensuring that the very elderly can have dignity, can have care that allows them to stay with independence to the degree possible, as long as possible? And as soon as we open this option, it does, by definition, become an easier and quicker and cheaper option, and brings life into sort of calculations of priorities in a very disturbing, worrying way. So this is a summary, I suppose, of messaging. And I share it in the way I do so that we can feel able to talk to friends, to neighbors, to politicians, to people of influence. And just as I said, as I began, as informed citizens, in a way that isn't just a parochial Jewish approach. We need to understand the halacha. We need to know our values. We need to know what the Torah teaches us about what it means to be a human being and how to live our lives. But we also need to understand that the Torah actually gives us an incredible resource to think within broader society about what sort of society we live in and what sort of values we want to embody. And I do think that even those who are not within a halachic framework and are not used to the language of halachic discourse or don't believe in it, can nonetheless hopefully hear in this something around concerns that I think every person should feel around the so-called assisted dying or terminal ends of life legislation. I will pause for a few moments because I'm conscious that I've raised a number of sensitive issues, and if anything I've said to anyone is unclear or disturbing, please do let me know. And the second part of what I want to talk about is to try and understand in a more nuanced way what actually are the halachas around end of life, which, as I said, there are often misunderstandings both ways. And sometimes people think we are more extreme in preserving end of life than we are and demand heroics beyond what we really demand. And sometimes people think that we are allow anything to go and just to try and understand a little bit the middle path that halacha adopts. But let me just pause for a few moments in case there's a Okay, I will be available afterwards and online if anything I've said has created upset or has been insensitive in any way. What can we say around the halachic approach towards the ends of life? And as I mentioned, there are quite dense source sheets here, and I've been also posted online as a link in the on the Zoom recording and in the YouTube recording. But we're not going to look much at these sheets. I simply felt they're an important resource for everyone to have. And I want to try and summarize really within the time available the main halachic principles, and I think that should be achievable on a very surface level at least. And there are basically an interplay between 4 or 5 halachas. That's what it comes down to. And this is on page 1 in the source sheet, simply bullet points. The first of these is lo sitzach, thou shalt not murder. And this is the first halacha that always needs to be thought about as we look at end of life decisions. We humans are not allowed to murder, and we'll unpick each of these in turn. The second halacha is lo sa'amod al dam re'acha. Lo ta'amod, do not stand by, do not stand over the blood of your fellow human being. So we're not allowed to stand idly by as someone, metaphorically or literally, bleeds to death. The third halachic principle is a medical ethic, principle of medical ethics, v'rapo yirapeh, someone who is medically able, a medical practitioner, a doctor, a nurse, anyone else in the field, a physiotherapist, a pharmacist, a chemist, has an obligation to heal, v'rapo yirapeh, has an allowance and an obligation to heal, and we need to unpick what that means also. And the fourth relevant pasuk is v'ahavta l're'echa k'mocha, thou shalt love thy neighbor like oneself. We have an obligation to love each other, to behave with empathy and sympathy and understanding and care. There's a general obligation of compassion and care towards anyone. These are basically the halachic principles. And everything else, in a sense, this is kol haTorah kula leg halachas. This is the whole Torah of end of life care on one leg, and everything else is really just trying to apply these halachas and address and deal with them when out of them emerge sometimes contradictory principles or clashing principles, as can be the case. So taking them one by one, the first is lo sitzach, not to murder, which means not to murder nor to cause the death of another human being. We're not allowed to murder, we're not allowed to cause the death of another human being, other than in certainly court-mandated capital punishment cases and the like, war. Other than that, lo sitzach, we're not allowed to cause the death of another innocent human being. Now, it's important to understand that whilst there may be differing layers of halacha around this, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean, ultimately any layer around this is within the broad prohibition of lo sitzach. So let me just explain what I mean. There are cases where one can directly cause a result, and there are cases where one will indirectly cause a result. Many of us may be familiar with this from, let's say, Shabbos, where you have a concept of groma, indirect causation, and maybe there's certain circumstances where that's a leniency with respect to the Shabbos. With respect to ritzicha, to terminating someone's life, none of these leniencies are applicable. They are all included in the prohibition of Litzitzach to some degree or other. They may not all cross the threshold of capital punishment. Litzitzach is a capital offense in halacha, but nonetheless, they are all included in the prohibition. One can't easily translate across from different halachic realms. I mean, if someone stands in court accused of murder, and he says, Your Honor, I did it with my left hand's little finger, I pulled the trigger, it's a shinoi. And I was taught that in Hilchas Shabbos, when you do something with a shinoi, then that lessens the prohibition. In certain cases that can even be allowed. That's clearly not applicable. Each area of halacha works within its own parameters and its own frameworks and its own internal logic, and needs to be assessed in its own way. And similarly, lo sitzach, shinoi is not an argument. Dover she'einu miskaven. Well, it was an unintended side consequence, and I've learned in Hilchas Shabbos, in certain cases where there's an unintended side consequence, you don't need to worry about it. These are not allowances in the concept of lo sitzach, and it's beyond the scope of this share to understand which halachas they do apply to and don't apply to. But that's the lav, that's the prohibition of lo sitzach. If we look in the source 1 on page 1 in the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, and I've said I'm not going to overuse these sources, but if one wants sort of black and white source, this is the point really that the Ramah makes. He's talking about a case actually where someone is nearing end of life and suffering, and for obvious reasons, the family are in pain to see their loved one suffering. And the Ramah says, nonetheless, one cannot do anything which actively causes cessation of life, as opposed to removing that which is continuing life. And here we will come to a potential important distinction, that it may be the case that there are certain scenarios where you do not need to actively treat, but God forbid that that should be taken as doing anything which proactively causes death. Causing death is never allowed. One is never allowed to make a decision to cause death actively in order to do something which triggers or starts a causal chain, even one which is very indirect, which will result in the death of another human being. That is all included in lo seitzach to some degree or other, and there's no allowance around that. There's no mokum lahakal, no space for leniency. However, does that mean that we always need to treat? That's already a separate, different equation. So that takes us through lo seitzach. What is our obligation to treat? If I'm not actively causing death or setting into motion a chain of events, however indirectly that will cause death, what is my obligation to treat? And here we come to the second of our bullet points. And really all we need to share in terms of the source sheet is these 4 bullet points at the top and a source that we will look at a little later on page 4. Those are the extent of the sources that are essential, but I want everyone to have access to the full sources here. The second pasuk is lo sa'amod al dam re'echa. Do not stand by idly over one's fellow's blood. And we take this pasuk for granted because we've sort of absorbed it in the Weltanschauung, in the sort of the heart of Jewish medical and life ethics. But it is a chiddush. It's not an obvious ethical requirement. In fact, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of law, and I believe also in Roman law, this was not an ethical requirement. If I am walking along the street and I am heading to a desperately important appointment, to a job interview for a job that I'm desperate to get, and someone collapses in front of me, in law, I may be entitled to step over them and continue on my way. It may not be a legal obligation to step forward and save their lives. In halacha, this is not the case. There is an expectation of lo samod dam re'echa. If I'm able to treat them, I need to treat them, and if I'm not able to, I need to call hatzalah or an ambulance. I can't just stand idly by and step over them in that case. In fact, Israel, which inherited via the British Mandate version of English common law, passed a law in which they tweaked this requirement and said there is an obligation to save life when one's able to do so. And the law in Israel is known as the Lo Samod Dam Re'echa law because there isn't an equivalent. It was a law that was influenced by Jewish ethics, by halachic ethics, because there isn't such a law in the Anglosphere of legal tradition. So this is the requirement of Lo Samod Dam Re'echa. In English law, for example, even if you become aware of a conspiracy to commit a crime, which will involve death, one does not legally have to report it always. One may have a professional obligation to do so if one is a lawyer or an accountant. If one is in any way part of the conspiracy, one is in breach of law. But if one becomes aware of it completely as an outsider, again, because there isn't an obligation of Lo Samod, this was not something assumed in English law, and there's been a lot of debate around terrorism legislation, which has been trying to tweak this, whether this is going against common law tradition. So Lo Samod Dam Re'echa is a second halacha, which means I can't stand idly by. I have an obligation to save life if I'm able to do so. And this is the second halachic principle that will be at work. The third halachic principle, which I'll touch on briefly now, but we'll get back to in more detail, is v'rapo yirape. And I just want to speak a little bit about this pasuk so we can understand the context. The pasuk v'rapo yirape, you shall surely heal, is not found in the framework of a mitzvah. It's found in the context of civil disputes and damages. So someone injures their fellow, and they have tort law. They have expectation of compensation of payment for damages, nizikin. And amongst the damages is that of healing v'rapo yirape. They're responsible for the healing of the victim. And the Gemara, in a rather mysterious statement, comments on this and another pasuk, which I'm not going to go into now. V'rapo yirape. Mikan, from here we learn that nitin reshus l'roife l'rapos, that permission is given to a doctor to heal. A doctor has permission and perhaps an obligation to heal, to engage in medical care. And we need to unpick that a little bit. What does that mean? But for our purposes now, at least round one on just a very surface level, out of a pasuk to do with the legislation around damages, we do see that medical care is an obligation on the person who caused the damage to pay compensation, but there is a value in the realm and the sector of medical care. Medical care healing is a legitimate Jewish pursuit. Why would we think otherwise? We need to understand, but that's what we see in the pasuk of Rapi Rapeh. And finally, V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha is a pasuk cited widely by the poskim as they look at end-of-life care, which is we always need to be thinking about acting in the best interests of the patient and their care and try and mitigate ill health and pain and suffering to the best of our ability. These are the four principles at work. Now, I want us to turn perhaps to page 4 and just look at source 5 there for a few moments, and that will be the extent of sources that we look at inside. But this is a very, very important source. It is not a primary source, it is a secondary source, but it is useful because it's quite a cogent summary of so much around this topic. And I just want to spend some time understanding what are the basic principles around end-of-life care. This source comes from an encyclopedia of sorts of Jewish medical ethics called Nishmas Avram. So it's a secondary source. The author is someone called Professor Abraham, Professor Avram. He was born in mid-1930s in Israel. He's got an English connection. Actually, he studied in Leeds University, and that's where he qualified as a doctor and moved back to Israel. He was, before he retired, he's now in his, must be late 80s. He was a professor of medicine in Hadassah Medical School and in Hebrew University, and a Talmud Chacham, a very learned individual. And he spent a lot of his career worrying about medical ethics and dealing with it, and in particular, consulting widely many of the leading poskim around issues of medical ethics. And to some degree or other, you can almost say when you want to learn Jewish medical ethics, at least the first stage that takes us through to let's say the 1980s, mid-1980s, there's really two sources to look at. The Nishmas Avram, which is this encyclopedic summary of basically the Israeli poskim, and Ramosha Feinstein, who was the dominant figure in medical halacha in America. Those are really, in a way, the two pillars of a lot of medical ethics. And to a large degree, when it comes to end-of-life care, there's significant agreement amongst the poskim. So this is beyond the scope of our discussion. When it comes to abortion and things like that, there's quite wide gulf between the poskim. When it comes to end-of-life care, there is a sort of consensus that emerges from between all their writings. In the context of our discussion, we'll be primarily looking at Ramosha Feinstein, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and Rabbi Lezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer. Those are the sort of three figures that I've selected for today. But there is a sort of consensus that emerges from all of them and many other important figures on the Israeli rabbinical scene. And the Nishmas Avram says that there are basically 4 criteria to decide to withdraw treatment. And have a look just at source 5. He's talking about DNR, about not resuscitating. And he says the following conditions. This is literally halfway down source 5. Source 5 is a screenshot from the Otzar Chachma where I took his cribbed off his encyclopedia. And in Aleph, he says, there's no cure available. He's at the end stage of his illness. So condition number 1 is that there is no available treatment. Condition number 2 is that the patient is suffering, either physically or extreme mental suffering. Condition number 3 is any treatment can extend life temporarily, but not long-term. And number 4 is that this has been discussed personally with rabbinic advice. In other words, this isn't a decision that families should make alone. It's something that should be talked through with a competent halachist. And I think it's vital for us to understand these conditions and where they are coming from and what the basis of this is. And this is why I began by talking about the bullet points at the beginning about what halachas are here in essence. In essence, our obligation always has to work through these halachas that we started with. We first have to check that there is no lo sitzach. I'm not actively causing death. And this is non-negotiable. One cannot set into motion any causal chain that will directly cause the death of the patient. However, what about withdrawing treatment? Well, we have a halacha of lo samud adam re'echa. Don't stand by idly over the blood of one's fellow. However, If we are unable to save the person's life, we are unable to save the life. So a samud will not necessarily apply because we can't save the person's life. However, we have an obligation to heal. What does healing mean? Healing means either restoring someone to health, i.e. being able to heal them, or pain relief. Because pain is a condition of suffering, and if we can heal the person to cause pain relief, then we have an obligation to so do. If the person cannot be restored to permanent life, to Chai Olam, but only to Chai Shah, to temporary life, and again, what we mean by temporary life and how long we mean is beyond the scope of this discussion, but one's unable to restore to long-term life, and we are unable to offer the patient sufficient pain relief, then healing is not possible, and therefore the doctor does not have an obligation to heal. In addition to this nishmas of Ram, we might add, and this is the consensus of poskim, that if the patient wants to live, then we have an obligation to heal. So even if the patient is suffering, and even if long-term life isn't possible, but if the patient wants to fight for their life, then that would also be a criteria. So what emerges from this is that we can withdraw treatment when losamad lamreacha is not possible, we can't save the patient's life, and when v'rapi is not possible, we can't heal. What does it mean we can't heal? We do not have a means of the patient is suffering, we do not have a means of alleviating the pain, and we don't have a way of restoring Chai Olam, long-term life. Now, Chai Olam literally means eternal life. None of us live forever. It means a span of life which is a significant amount, and it's beyond the scope of this discussion to define that exactly, as opposed to Chai Shah, where the illness in front of us will inevitably kill the person in a projected, ongoing, rolling manner in a way in which we can be confident that sadly and tragically that will happen. And he doesn't mention this condition, but discusses it elsewhere. As I said, if the patient's will is to continue fighting for their life, then again, the doctor would have a halachic obligation to treat, not just because of a haftar re'echa kamocha, because this is what the patient wants, but also because of rapi. If the person wants to live, then that is a healing, a refuah of sorts. This is what emerges in the language of the poskim. And I want to just try and elaborate a little bit on this and try and give a sense of how this emerges from the language and just a couple of the sources around this, just to give us a little bit of a feel of how this works. A primary source mentions, we're not going to read this inside, in source 2 on page 1, mentions by Ramosha Feinstein and others, and put in bold, is a difficult Gemara in Ksuvas. It's a Gemara in Ksuvas, Daf Kuf Daled, in which the Gemara talks about the end of life of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the editor and author of the Mishnah, very, very important Tanaitic Mishnah era figure. And he was sadly suffering at the end of his life and unable to receive treatment. The doctors were unable to restore to health. And the Talmidim and students and family of Rabbi Hanossi were devastated and were davening for his healing. And the maidservant, the Rebbe, the maidservant, the household help, who had been apparently connected to the family for many years and is cited elsewhere in Shas also as being a knowledgeable person, she says, we're davening normally. He's suffering. And she davens for his demise and for the end of his suffering. Now, the Gemara indicates that she made the correct decision. And this is beyond the scope of our share, but I will say there are cases where if one sees someone in a terminal situation suffering, we don't normally adopt the stance of davening for someone's death, but we would say rather than davening for healing, sometimes there are cases where it ceases to be appropriate for davening for healing, and we daven that they should know rachamei shamayim, they should know mercy from heaven in whatever shape or form, and we sort of suspend the expectation on us humans to sort of know what's best and to be sure that life is best in this situation, and we'll daven for just generic rachamei shamayim. In the Gemara story, she davened for more than that. She davened that Rebbe should indeed die. And Ramosha discusses this Gemara and to what degree a sort of quasi-midrashic Gemara can be used as a halachic source, and to what degree we can compare tefillah to medical intervention. I don't want to simplify what's a more complicated argument, but the bottom line of what Rebbe comes out from this Gemara, from what Ramosha Feinstein comes out from this Gemara, is that it is not a Jewish value to extend life where there is suffering, and where no treatment ultimately is possible. You see in that story, if nothing else, even if you can't extrapolate from a medrash to halacha, and you can't extrapolate from tefillah to medical treatment, nonetheless, you do see a value at work over here. And the value at work is that to intervene, to extend suffering, is not required in halacha, and may indeed be a breach of a of basic compassion. And therefore, whilst we cannot actively cause death, which can mean doing anything which will trigger the death process, or perhaps once someone is on an automated life maintenance system, withdraw it, but we do not need to proactively start treatment in such a situation. We can't do sitzach, we can't, God forbid, murder or cause death, but we can avoid treatment. And this is basically what Ramosha Feinstein says in the bold over here. In source 3, he adds in a number of provisos, and he mentions there also, by the way, the need to assess what the patient would want. If the patient is able to express a view and the patient wants to carry on living, one should grant them that, obviously. In the absence of the patient being able to voice a view, we presume the family are acting in the best interest of the patient, unless there's evidence to the contrary, and therefore the family can say whether they believe the patient would want to have ongoing treatment or not, and so on and so forth. And Ramosha discusses why medicine has to work in such a manner. But Ramosha now adds a crucial point, and this is added by Ramosha in his comments at the top of page 3 and at the bottom of page 3, and by Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in source 4 on page 4. And they are all express basically the same halachic idea, and this is very, very crucial and critical. They all say that even though medical treatment is sadly no longer a requirement because this is no longer possible for the terminal illness that will kill the patient. So let's just give a painful example. Someone has very far developed cancer, and we could give treatment that would slow down the spread of the cancer, but ultimately not stop it. Ultimately, we know that the cancer will definitely kill the patient within a relatively short amount of time, however we define that, but a period of months as opposed to years, and there is suffering. At that point, we no longer need to treat the cancer because there's no this is going to kill the patient, and there's no rapid, we can't heal the cancer. However, what happens if the patient, for example, gets a secondary infection? And this is very common, develops a pneumonia, for example. And the pneumonia can be treated. The pneumonia can be treated by antibiotics. However, if we don't treat the antibiotics, the patient will die from the pneumonia and their suffering will come to an end more swiftly. On that, Ramosha says we are absolutely obligated to treat the pneumonia because with respect to the pneumonia, we do have an ability to heal. The Rapid does apply. We are able to heal the pneumonia. And we cannot make a cheshbon and say, well, let's not heal the pneumonia in order to cause an early passing of the individual because we think that will minimize their suffering. We have an obligation of refuah in such a case, and therefore basic antibiotic treatment, for example, of pneumonia is a requirement. In a little bit of time, I'll sort of try and bring this into practical halacha because there are complexities around all these points. So I'm just trying to give, for now, the principles. Similarly, says Ramosha, when it comes to basic hydration, and in theory, nutrition also, though for various technical reasons, the question is less often around nutrition. When it comes to basic hydration, even though we may be tempted to say, let's stop hydrating the patient, maybe by this stage the patient is unable to drink themselves, and therefore we're talking about subcutaneous hydration or intravenous hydration, we may be tempted to say, well, if we stop hydrating, the patient will pass more swiftly. That isn't what we mean by the concept of chayshah. The logic of temporary life is we are unable to treat the patient. There's a terminal illness which we can maybe extend their life a little bit, but we are unable to treat. We can't ultimately remove pain, and we can't ultimately heal this illness which is going to kill the patient without them having a relatively normal span of life. So the obligation to treat the primary illness has ceased, but that doesn't give us an obligation to take a human being and stop hydrating them. And therefore hydration, again, would remain a chiyuv. That's the principle of Ramosha, and one that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman and others also express. I want to say one other halachic principle and then use the time available just to make some practical comments about navigating ends of life care on a practical halachic basis. And the final comment is around pain relief and a series of teshuvos which I printed on page 5 and page 6. At the top of page 5 is a tshuva from Sitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg. At the bottom of page 5 is another summary from this encyclopedic work, the Nishmas Avram. And on page 6 are some sources from Ramosha Sternbach and so on. Ignore the bottom sources on page 6, they repeat the earlier ones. I messed up my source sheet. But these are various halachic sources that talk about pain relief. And I just want to make several comments around pain relief, and with that conclude the halachic theory and principles, and then just make a few comments around practical application of this. We live in an age where, thank God, significant pain relief is very often possible, including high levels of morphine in particular and other pain relieving medication. And one of the challenges is that giving of this pain relief can cause a reduced life expectancy. So if no pain relief is given, then the patient will live a certain amount of time. If pain relief is given, quantities of, let's say, morphine can eventually damage the patient's body and health, and perhaps cause slightly earlier death. And the discussion in the postscript is what level of pain relief is allowed in this manner. And here they say a number of really profound points which are important. The first point Rabbi Waldenberg says is to relook at the concept of v'rapo yirape. There's an obligation on doctors to heal. And he asks, and permission to doctors to heal. In fact, that's the language of the Gemara. From here, Rishus, permission is given to doctors to heal. Why do doctors need permission to heal? Well, of course they can heal. Why shouldn't they? And the Ramban, who was a doctor himself, answers that all procedures carry some level of risk. No procedure is risk-free. What allows a doctor to make a judgment call of net benefit to the patient? Well, sometimes the percentages are high and the patient needs to consent, or family needs to consent, or indeed a posek or a rav would need to be asked. But sometimes the ratio is significantly limited that the normal course of treatment would be to treat, even though every procedure has some degree of risk. And this is what he understands by the permission given to the doctor to heal. Rabbi Waldenberg understands that to include also pain relief. In other words, carefully given pain relief. We're not talking about irresponsible levels and doses of morphine, but carefully given pain relief, in which the doctor is doing their best to reduce pain to a reasonable degree, and at the same time do their best not to give a dose that will shorten life, even though it carries with it a risk of shortened life, according to the Tzitz Eliezer, is allowed within v'rapo yirape. A doctor has an obligation to heal, and pain relief is part of healing. This is one idea he expresses. A second idea he expresses, and other posts can give, is an intuition that pain and untreated pain also causes early demise. In other words, we're not in a situation where you're just weighing up, well, don't treat the pain and the person will live longer, because pain itself is a cause of can be a cause of early death. A patient who's racked by pain is unable to sleep as well, unable to eat as well. The body is under enormous stress, and that must have an effect, say the poskim, on the healing of the patient. Interestingly, at the time these tshuvas are written, there's no evidence or research to demonstrate this. But they are saying this is obvious. It must be the case that relieving pain also affects the life expectancy of the patient. It can't be otherwise. We don't have research here, but this is obvious to us that this is the case, and therefore this is the legitimate halachic calculus. I'll mention just a couple of other points they say, and then we'll conclude this subsection. I don't want to go into this in too much detail. There's an interesting discussion about how we deal with iterative causes of death. No one dose of morphine is going to cause death. It's just an accumulation over time, and any one giving of morphine we don't know what will cause death. There's a number of doubts over here, and they discuss how to deal with that in the context of lo setzach. What they do say is that the doctors, absolutely we have to be sure that the intention of the doctor is only pain relief and not shortening the life of the patient. There's no justification for using morphine to shorten the life of the patient, only to try and give as sensitively applied pain relief as possible. Number two, the doctor should be confident that no one injection or no one delivery of morphine will cause death, even though statistically we know on the long run this could cause slightly early death, and the various other arguments that we have given. I just want to conclude with a sort of a number of practical points around this, and with that, I'll stop, but I'll remain for questions. The first thing is that I think that when we are caring for the elderly and when we are making decisions like this, it is important to have a posik, to be in contact with a Rav who understands these halachas. And we saw already the Nishmas of Ram puts this down as a formal requirement of decision making. And there's a number of reasons why this is useful. It does allow one to process one's decisions and just talk to an outsider. Sometimes one is so caught up in pain and distress that it's very hard to think clearly. And we are full of compassion and empathy. And it's helpful to have a voice of someone to talk to and a halachic view to be expressed. If we don't do that, we can sometimes end up being unduly makel and open to withdrawal of treatment, which isn't halachically acceptable, or unduly machmir and end up with heroics, which aren't mandated or demanded by halacha and inappropriate. The second point I want to make is that even though there are points sometimes of conflict with doctors and current secular medical ethics around these things, it is important that we do not, God forbid, see the doctors or the medical staff as the enemy. They are not the enemy. They are trying to serve with compassion. When their ethical intuition differs to halacha, they are not coming from a place, God forbid, of a lack of care about the value of life. They are simply there on the field, seeing the suffering and resent it when we sort of give an impression that we see them as being callous or uncaring. On the contrary, sometimes they look at our approach and see that as uncaring. I think it's important that, therefore, when we do need to push, sometimes we do so with an understanding and empathy of where the doctors are coming from. And I have to tell you, there are sincerely and profoundly from doctors who sometimes struggle with the halachic approach to this. That doesn't mean the halacha is wrong. It doesn't mean we should change this. But I share this simply to say that when you're out there on the field and you're seeing a patient suffering, it can sometimes be very difficult. Where are the cases when our approach can be difficult, and where are the cases where actually I think we should feel very comfortable with our approach? And I just share this to give you a sense of what's going on. Well, often discussed is resuscitation, DNR, and decisions around that. Now, I have to tell you that when we are dealing with profoundly ill patients or very elderly and frail patients, very near the end of their life, or racked with cancer or the like, the truth is, this is the theoretical debate. Resuscitation works when someone has the ability to function, for their body systems to keep their heart going, breathing going, and the like. And for some reason, something has stopped it temporarily. They've been in an accident, had an electric shock. Something's happened, and if we can restart, their lives can be saved. When you're dealing with someone where the system, where the systems are racked with disease, or the person is right near the end of life, there's a reason why the systems are stopping or shutting down. And resuscitation isn't going to help. It may temporarily restart, but then it's going to stop again, and it may temporarily restart. There's a reason why the person is dying, and the systems are shutting down. Now, nonetheless, the advice of Rabbanim is not to engage in an agreement not to resuscitate, because at the end of the day, each case is different. Why should we decide when someone goes into hospital what will be the eventual outcome, even though the doctors wish us to decide? And I think so. Let's wait and see and judge on a case-by-case basis and see where things are up to. We also want to give a message that we value the life of this person. We're not seeing this person as being expendable in any way. And we sort of, on an ethos point of view, don't believe this is an appropriate discussion normally to have. But I do want to emphasize that this isn't really, generally speaking, the cutting edge of a clash between halachic values and halacha and medical treatment, because in reality, when we are dealing with someone near the end of their life, resuscitation is not going to help. There's a reason why the systems are stopped, and resuscitation won't help. Going to the opposite extreme, somewhere where we should fight and we should be confident of our viewpoint, are things like treating pneumonia. Now, pneumonia is often actually what kills very elderly or ill people. When we talk about them dying from a disease, what do we mean they actually die from disease? Very often it means that their lungs become ever more blocked up, they're unable to clear their lungs, and unfortunately they drown with the pneumonia. Now here, our stance is treat aggressively with a round of antibiotics and another round of antibiotics and another, and if it doesn't help, another round of antibiotics. And we don't see a reason to stop treatment. And the current reigning medical ethics is often, well, the person is so elderly and so ill, let's not treat the pneumonia, or we'll try a round of antibiotics, or even 2 rounds of antibiotics, but why continue to try? If it's not working, why do another round of antibiotics? What good is it going to do? And anyway, the person is dying and suffering. And anyway, the antibiotics aren't likely to work, and they have some horrible side effects. They can cause diarrhea, they can cause stomach problems, and so on and so forth. So why keep trying? And our response to that is that this is a secondary disease which is potentially treatable, and there isn't a significant downside in trying again with another antibiotic. If it helps, it helps. If it doesn't help, it doesn't help. It will cause stomach cramps and other things. Okay, but that isn't a reason not to try and treat in order to save the life of the patients. And therefore, this is an example of something where halacha would demand of us, and we should push for active treatment. Pain relief, we should push for careful iteration. We should try and get the doctor who understands our values, who's trying to relieve pain, but also very, very sensitive to doing so in a manner in which it is not significantly shortening the life of the patient. Again, this is an area that we should be conscious of. We are blessed, by the way, and I should mention this, with outstanding from medical practitioners in the community, and if possible, get some of them involved. In other words, ask their opinion. For sometimes they are within hospitals where they can come into the ward under the NHS. Sometimes they can be seen privately, and if you're lucky enough to have medical insurance, that can cover it. Or if not, it's a one-off private appointment, so it's a relatively containable sum of money. But the requirement to get this right does demand some expenditure where possible and where it can make a difference, and we should be conscious of that. And as I said, things like treating pneumonia. If it's the third round or fourth round, so be it. Maybe unlikely to succeed, but why not in halacha? And more than why not? Since why not? Therefore, one absolutely should do so. And the fact that there's maybe increasing in the long term over the general population resistance to antibiotics and so on is not a factor when we are looking at a life in front of us. Cases which can be very painful, and this is an area where sometimes halacha can take a different stance to general medical practice, and it is difficult for families, and this is certainly a case where one needs support of an understanding halachist, is when, for example, patients with very, very advanced Alzheimer's or dementia, where they sometimes lose the ability to swallow, and the only way to get them sufficient nutrition can be through a peg, through a pipe and the like. And sometimes you have cases where this is very painful to see. You're putting in a peg or a pipe for someone who is very elderly, not functioning at any level, with very, very advanced dementia. Sometimes they don't understand why this is being put into them. It's uncomfortable. They're trying to pull it out. They have a very low quality of life at this point. But halacha at this point, it does demand of us to do so based on the criteria we have. The person does not have chayei shah. This is not temporary life. They have chayei olam. They can live for a relatively long amount of time. Not going to live forever, no one does, but they can live for a long amount of time. And we have a method of treating them, and it's not treatments, it's basic food. And as I said, we can't withdraw food or hydration. But these are cases which are very difficult and very painful, very, very tough for the families and the doctors concerned, but can be dealt with in a manner in which the patient can be supported and can get through it. And it's really important at that point to try and get rabbinic support and, if possible, from doctors who understand the issues on board. I'll finally make a mention around hydration. And again, hydration, as we saw, is something that's required. There are means to hydration. Generally, intravenous is the best method of hydration. There can be cases where subcutaneous is better, but in general, we'd encourage intravenous because it's a better way of delivering the liquids. Doctors will often say, and they're correct, that there's limited absorption of the liquid, and therefore they don't wish to carry on hydrating. The patient can be swelling. We can see evidence that their body's no longer absorbing the hydration. Nonetheless, from a halachic point of view, we would say, okay, the body's only absorbing 10 or 20% of the hydration, so be it. If you don't hydrate, the person will die of dehydration. If you do hydrate, the person is receiving hydration. Here, again, it's important to have a doctor who you trust and who understands the situation and who will work with us as a team, because there can be cases where the patient is going to die before they become dehydrated, and there's no point, therefore, in hydrating them. In other words, if systems are shutting down and this is really near the end of life, what's the point of hydrating someone when they've got enough hydration within them or enough nutrition within them to live for another few days, and they're not going to live out those few days? And in such a case, hydration indeed is pointless. But in general, hydration, as we saw, is something that Rabbi Zobin and other poskim deem obligatory because it's not treatment of an illness, it's just basic life sustaining. And the allowance not to treat is because of you're up. We can't heal, but this isn't healing, this is basic treatment. So that gives a summary of some points, some common cases of concern. One does need to think a little bit holistically. Halacha does recognize that sometimes just treating doesn't achieve anything, can extend a life just with suffering, or sometimes actually shorten life, because by giving a person a good quality of life and less intervention, sometimes that can actually be the thing that lengthens their life, because needless treatment is just causing the body trauma without any benefit. So the idea that we are always pushing for heroics is not correct. On the other hand, there are areas of clash with current standard medical norms, and building a good, positive relationship with the doctors and competent Rav, and if need be, perhaps also bringing in some of the from doctors to help advise so you can understand better, can hopefully ease these important decisions. And I conclude obviously with the tefillah that all of us should have good health, should only know good health, and also with the tefillah that nothing I've said has these are sensitive, life and painful decisions around mortality and so on, and nothing I've said is meant to indicate a lack of empathy and awareness of the pain that people go through. And please God, Kodesh Baruch Hu should send us all good health. Thank you very, very much.
Dayan Zobin, may we ask a question?
Yes, absolutely. I've got people live, and I'll alternate one Zoom, one live. There's quite a lot of questions. Yes.
In your introduction of the bill, you mentioned fifth principle, but in the very first fourth, I'm interested in. You mentioned lift there. If this bill goes through and becomes an act,
yes,
and someone's interested in actively taking advantage of the provisions it provides, to what extent are we halachically obligated to take active steps to thwart their using the rights of the bill? The bill does contain, by the way, a clause saying that you conscientiously object to anything there, you're not under any duty to do it. But going further,
a person should try and save lives, and therefore, if one becomes aware of a family member, or God forbid, who's in this situation, one can alleviate it. One should. I didn't even mention in terms of the bill. I mean, there's things that are I think somewhat hair-raising. At the moment, it says, for example, judges have to assess whether coercion is an issue. I'm not a lawyer, and I think I've understood this correctly, and I've spoken to lawyers, but I may be making a mistake. From what I can understand, the law, the way it's been put forward is to do so in a manner according with civil law. Now, civil law, from what I understand, takes a balance of probability. That means to say that we are deciding the life and death of someone based on a balance of probability, 51%, 49%, 55%, 45%, a balance of probability. It's not using the standards of evidence that we normally have in such serious decisions of beyond reasonable doubt. So we're deciding on balance of probability, there's no coercion, because that's the civil law algorithm rubric used for judges to make decisions. Then the law says a 6-month life expectancy. Again, I spoke to doctors. I don't know if this is exactly right, but I'm hearing figures. The ability of doctors to assess life expectancy of 6 months ranges somewhere between 30 and 50%. So a doctor can say this person only has a life expectancy of 6 months. That's what's put into the law. How accurate is that assessment? As far as we can see, below 50% probability that they're getting it right. So I know using statistics is dangerous. So again, if I've misunderstood the statistics, I apologize, but that's my understanding of them. There's a lot to worry about. And yes, I think if we become aware, we should do our best to save someone's life. Absolutely. Gary, you're the sort of admin on the Zoom one, so I'll alternate Zoom and live. If there's anyone who wants to ask.
Thank you very much. We've looked at things very much from the perspective.
And I can't be on my phone in the chat, I'm afraid, just because I'm using my phone. So if you want to read out any chat questions, please do so also.
Okay, I look for them. Could I ask my question first? Thank you very much. We've looked at things very much from the perspective of the doctor or of the family. What are the guidelines about whether a patient can put up a DNR? And if a doctor comes along and the patient is, what does he do when he sees a DNR?
Okay, so I'm not going to go into medical ethics of a from doctor working in a hospital when they're being asked to do things which are halachically problematic. A doctor is called upon to do an abortion when an abortion's a problem, or a medical procedure that's medically problematic, and so on. This is beyond the scope of this discussion. What I would say, as I briefly mentioned, is that a DNR it has become, even though decades ago it was very much the dogma of where there was sometimes seen a clash between medical ethics and halacha, it's become a little bit of a red herring nowadays. It isn't a significant clash. And therefore, whilst I would encourage people to encourage elderly relatives not to sign a DNR, I wouldn't make it a sort of battleground over it, because the reality is, sadly, in cases of resuscitation, is not going to help. It's not. I don't think it's right to pick particularly. Gary, I'll wait for you for a chat question. I'll take someone live, and then we'll take another Zoom question. If I saw some hands up. Yes. Yes.
the Jesus value. It's difficult to see, to hear that and understand value.
Yes. So the question was about the value in suffering. Does Judaism see a value in suffering and the value of life when there is suffering? So I would like to say 2 points. The first is we definitely don't see value in choosing suffering. There's no mitzvah to go and choose a miserable life in suffering. However, there is a value in life and a value in seeing a purpose in life no matter what it throws at you. And certainly there are, I'm not here talking about extreme cases, but let's take moderate cases and then we'll go to extreme cases shortly. But there are people who go through enormous suffering that still go on to achieve amazing things. And famously, as per Man's Search for Meaning and other such work, ultimately how we choose to approach suffering and the mindset we bring to a situation can have value, enormous value, no matter what we're going through on an external level. And I'm conscious I'm sitting here from the sort of comfort of a nice chair in Israel and Baruch Hashem healthy and you know in the beautiful life of Northwest London. I don't mean to diminish some real things that people go through, and it's very smug and easy to say it here, and hard to do. But yes, ultimately humans have the ability to elevate any situation, and sometimes the perspective they bring to that in most cases. There can be extreme cases where someone has very limited consciousness, and it's really hard to see where is the Jewish value in life. All I will say then is that ultimately we don't understand that much about the neshama and the soul's role in the body. And we don't even understand that much on a philosophical basis about consciousness. We don't really know what are the conscious experiences of anyone, famously the problem of other minds and so on. I don't really know what your consciousness is like, never mind, treated philosophically, we don't understand that much about our own consciousness. And we don't understand that much about awareness and the like, even of people in the most extreme cases of loss of consciousness. So here we do end up in extreme cases with an emunah and a bitachon and a trust in Hashem that there's a value of the existence of a soul in this world, even where we can't see any consciousness and any engagement with the world in a significant way, and that does come down to emunah. But in most cases, even in cases other than these extreme cases, we don't choose suffering, but life has value to it, even when it includes suffering. I'll just try and give a little analogy around the problem of consciousness. And I don't want to go into a scientific and philosophical matter too much. I'm just going to make it as a statement without fully justifying it. But what I'm saying is not a Jewish point of view. It's a philosophically correct point of view, which is we don't know what the nature of consciousness is and how it interfaces with the world philosophically. And to give an analogy, imagine all humans were born with goggles over their eyes. And we noticed that over time, these goggles became scratched and vision deteriorated. And I put forward the argument that if we remove the goggles completely, eyesight would be restored. And now people might say, well, this is ridiculous. If the goggles are clearly the means through which we see. And if damaged goggles limit eyesight, how much more so remove goggles? But actually, in that analogy, it's clear if you remove the goggles, eyesight is restored. We don't know what the nature of the interface of consciousness with the world is. We have consciousness. If the brain deteriorates, what does that mean about the mind? Is the brain ultimately the seat of consciousness and generating consciousness, and therefore with the cessation of brain life, consciousness ceases? Or is it an interface through which consciousness operates in the world, and there's a consciousness that has an awareness, not through the goggles, not through the brain? As philosophy and neuroscience stands, we have no way and no knowledge about answering that question. And I know this is sort of counter the current trends of thinking, but here I'm telling you, if you research it, this is not a Jewish point of view, I'm not saying this is a rabbi or anything like that, it's not something that we have any idea about. We do not understand consciousness sufficiently to really make any categorical statements about that. So I would say, emunah and bitachon aside, we are playing a bit with fire when we terminate life. We don't really know that much about what life is. But it is difficult in extreme cases of ends of life, I recognize that. But in many cases, what we can even see, even leaving aside neshama, we can see a value to life and continuation of life, even with suffering. Yeah, let me just take something online and then I'll take another live question. Yes, Gary, if there's anyone who wants to ask online or...
Answer any questions in the chat.
Yes.
Gary,
do you want to read this out? Or?
To what extent is the fear of the patient to be taken into account? For example, with a degenerative muscle disease, where someone might end up choking to death because they can no longer swallow, and the fear of that approaching be allowed to override the need to suffer through it?
Yeah. Okay, these are the very, very painful questions. Degenerative diseases, motor neuron diseases, these are terrible cases. And these are certainly cases where we need empathy with those who are taking a different halachic or moral stance to us. Halacha at the end of the day says we cannot assist in the dying of another human being, even in these terrible cases of degenerative diseases where there's terrible mental anguish and a terrible, the person is a spectator to their own deterioration in a most terrible way. And we can't murder, and we can't facilitate murder. And that is where halacha stands. Even though for that particular individual patient, the suffering is enormous. In terms of treatment and withdrawal of treatment, then the normal criteria that we discussed would apply, and that would have to work through the sort of formula that we discussed around Osamos and Virapa Urapa and so on. In each case would have to be worked out in terms of withdrawal of treatment. In terms of actively facilitating causing death, that we God forbid cannot do. Though I recognise that enough people with relatives have been through this, have spoken to me recently around assisted dying. I've been party to various conversations where they've spoken with great anguish at the thought of the relatives going through that, or even people themselves who know they're going to go through this. And I understand that pain, but I believe halachically we can't allow murder, and I believe as a society, it's, as I tried to explain, it'd be a terrible destruction of society for us to allow murder in such cases. I'll take one more question then live and one more question online, and then I don't want to keep people. I've already kept people over time, and I apologise for that. Yes.
I seem to remember a story, which I believe is in a Gemara, but I'm sure you'll tell me it's not, about a lady who was going to shul every day, and she feels that she's too old to want to live, and she's told or given a suckle that she should stop going to shul, and then she would die. Is that story thinking about? How do we understand that?
So there's a number of stories you might be referencing, and I'm not it maybe you're sharing a combination of a story. But what I would say is, again, ceasing to use tefillah to maintain life is analogous to the famous story of the Seder Rebbe, the maidservant of Rebbe that we discussed. And therefore, that would be deemed ceasing to maintain life, equivalent to ceasing treatment, which would be justified. There are various other Gemaras that explore the boundaries of what's the threshold between ceasing treatment and actively causing death. And that's why I said I'm only giving broad principles here. There's this terrible story about the death of Hanina ben Tradian when he was being burned by the Romans. And he paskins, his Talmidim thought he could breathe in the flames, which would cause a swift death. He paskin, he can't do that, but he asked the Roman official to remove the wool that was around him, the wet wool that was maintaining his life in great pain. And there's a discussion about what the basis of that story is. There's many more detailed principles that need analysis in order to arrive at appropriate psak. All I've tried to do today is give general principles, and obviously these things are more complicated. Gary, you will tell me if there's any more questions online, and this will be the last question. I think we need. I'm happy to hang around here, but I don't want to keep people uncomfortably sitting here too long. Yeah.
There's nothing else on the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much to everyone for joining, and I'll hang around a little bit. I'm going to, Gary, will you turn the recording off? But I'm happy to ask for anyone on Zoom if they want to speak. But let's end the recording here also. Thank you very much. Good evening.